AtmoZakes is a nurse who practiced in Europe and also in Canada. And I met her purely by accident as I drove past her house, and I saw some wonderful gardens there with the most giant size sunflowers. And we just had to stop and we said hello. And then I found out that Atmo had been a nurse dealing with people who had polio. So we're going to ask her some questions. And Susan is here, SusanSchoenbeck, and she is here. And she will talk to us about being a person with polio who became a nurse. And we have other people here who were also nurses. So this will be very interesting. Helen for sure. And we'll have lots of questions and answers here. So I think I would like to ask Atmo to introduce yourself, and we will ask you some questions.
Okay. So I am an immigrant from Germany in Canada. I've been here for 58 years and love the country. But let me correct you on one little point. I was never able to work as a nurse in Canada because when I came here, I was just about to give birth to my first child. And after that, when I wanted to be a nurse, I hit a hurdle which I actually never surmounted. And that is a legal hurdle. I would have been obliged to redo my entire education as a nurse here in Canada if I wanted to work as a nurse. There was no program that adapted nursing from one country to the other. And to my knowledge, this is still the case. So I have never worked as a nurse in Quebec or in Canada, but I have done nursing in Germany, in Norway, in Peru, in the US, and probably, no, that's about it. So that being corrected, you can shoot all the questions. My experience with polio is one that dates from before the existence, or maybe not the existence, but before the use of polio vaccine in Germany. I was a student nurse from 1957 to 60. So, and to my knowledge, Berlin, where I was working, was one of the very first places that made the polio vaccine, the Sabin, available to people. And that was just 1 month after the DDR, which is the eastern part of Germany, when they were divided, adopted an vaccination program. And so Berlin had the power, being an independent Western sector and not part of Western Germany at the time. They had the possibility to make their own health decisions. And 1 month after it was adopted in the eastern side of town, it was also available in the western part of town. But that was already after I had finished my nursing experience with polio patients, which was when I was a student nurse. So to situate me, I was born in 1939 in Berlin, just a few months before the war started. We were expatriated to Czechoslovakia in the early months of 1942 on a order of Hitler to evacuate from Berlin every family that had more than 2 children. And we were 3. So we were evacuated to a place where we were supposed to be safer, because in 1942, Berlin was bombed on more than a daily basis. So we spent a lot of time in bunkers and hiding from bombs. When the Eastern Front advanced, we left Czechoslovakia, and I walked as a 6-year-old from Prague to Berlin, which is about 1,200 kilometers.
Oh.
And so that is my childhood. And my older sister became a nurse, and I think that is one of the reasons that I became a nurse. I wanted to become a doctor, but that was not something that was easily available to a girl in the 1940s. So nursing and secretarial work were about the only places that I was able to reach. When the teacher told my mother that he was ready to give me the extra education so that I could get to university, my mother said, she doesn't need that, she's going to get married. So that was the end of my medical dreams in the sense of becoming a doctor. And so I did what I today do not consider the next best thing, to become a nurse. I think it was a better choice. And so I started in nursing school when I was 16 and did 3 years education. And quite shortly after my examinations and after becoming a nurse, I went to Norway. And I worked there for a while as a nanny to learn the language, and then as a nurse again. And while I was a nurse in Norway, I worked in a very small hospital that was a regional hospital to give access to people in very remote areas to be able to reach a hospital. And while I was there, I got in contact with, I heard a talk of Abbé Pierre, which is, he was the leader and the instigator of a group called Emmaus. And it was people, the idea for people from Emmaus was to go to underdeveloped countries to work and live like the people in the barrios, to share their way of living so that they could share some of our education and we could share some of their living conditions as an experience. And I was there as a nurse. Again, we were taking care of about 1,500 children on all kinds of level. We had a school, a primary and a secondary school, a kindergarten, a crèche, what do you call garderie? What do you call it?
Daycare, a daycare.
Daycare, that's the word I'm looking for. We had a daycare center, and we were also having a center for women that were having all those children that they could find work. When they had their children in daycare and in school, then they could work. And that was how I worked with them. I had a tiny dispensarium that was about the size of my bathroom now. And I was trying to do as much nursing as I could in those conditions. And that is also a place where I got in contact with many, many different contagious diseases. But my contact with polio was strictly during my nursing education. We were sent, because in my hospital it didn't exist, to an infectious disease ward, and I was for 3 months working in the polio ward. And I'm getting goosebumps when I'm talking to you right now, because many of your questions are around what kind of working conditions I had. And I must admit that your contact, Mona, and involving me in this little talk here has absolutely changed my view of polio, has done enormous amounts of learning for me, and pointed out beliefs and ignorances that I didn't even know existed, that I had. For example, one of the things that we were told about polio, and that I really never questioned again, was that it was a waterborne disease, that we would get it only if we swam in dirty lakes at the end of the summer, and that was the most danger we would get from anybody getting polio. Can you imagine that I worked on a polio ward where there were people with iron lungs? There were not small children. There were mostly adolescents. I worked with people in iron lungs. I had absolutely no idea that I could get the disease by handling them. I was handling their feces, I was washing them, I was handling everything, because as student nurses, we were also the cheap labor of the place. So we were doing a lot of the work that today will be done by nurses' aides. So all the washing, all the cleaning, all the physiotherapy work that needed to be done. Physiotherapist, I have never heard of one in Germany while I was in learning. So it gives you an idea of the level of my ignorance and the level of my luck. Yeah, because to have worked there for 3 months and not gotten sick took some doing. It's pretty amazing. But I also have, it was a very emotional time for me, because as a nurse, we want to help, but I felt very, very helpless seeing young people of my own age, because that was the ones that we were taking care of, not being able to walk, not being able to sit up, not being able to drink, not being able to turn around in bed, some of them in iron lungs, where we had to make very much sure that they didn't get bed sores, and that they didn't get, that they got properly fed, that they get properly, that they got enough to drink, yeah? Because there was always too many patients per nurse, and always enormous, 12-hour shifts were the rule rather than the exemption. And that from a 17, 18-year-old, yeah, was dealing with people of the same age, was very emotionally disturbing, and making me feel helpless. And luckily, I didn't know how ignorant I was, because it would have just made everything worse. So please shoot with your questions, and ask me and I'll answer as honest as I can. I find that I have probably much more to learn from every single one of you than you from me. So I jump on the occasion. I hope you do too. Teach me what you can.
As you say, you were very lucky. I think a lot of the nurses that worked even here in Canada, they were also very lucky. Over the years, I did meet some of the nurses who worked in the polio wards. When I was a baby, of course, I didn't know them then, but they had joined our organization to see if they remembered any of the children. So you say that the people you had were older, 16 to 20?
Yes, yes, because I was in an adult hospital. That was probably the reason. We were rotated during our time. We had to do 3 months in every single of the specialties. So as there was no polio station in our hospital, I was sent to a different hospital for 3 months. And that hospital was an adult person hospital. So the youngest patient would have been 16.
What kind of surgeries were they getting, if any, on the wards you worked on?
None at all.
None.
None at all. I have not seen any surgery patient all the time, the 3 months I was there. We did get, the doctors gave prescriptions, for example, when somebody had an arm affected or a leg affected, for physiotherapy. And that is what we did with them. And I was, one very emotional moment was when a young man that was exactly my age, we actually had the same birthday. And that is why I remember it so clearly. After several months of walking with him and walking with crutches and slowly progressing from one implement to another, he did the first steps with me, just holding hands. And that was a very, very emotional moment. And that was after 3 months of being there with him. And it was very joyful, both for him and for me, that we could accomplish such a thing, that he could find back his ability to walk.
Wow.
My question is, did you know any nurses who actually got polio?
Not at that moment. I did later on, but not at that moment. And as I said, the transmission mode for polio before vaccination times was very much hazy. There were all kinds of, it reminds me a little bit of COVID now, because there's all kinds of suppositions of how it is transmitted, but there wasn't really any clear proof. Like today, when I read in your newsletter that they have found in the waters of New York polio viruses, it's clear what's happening and how it's happening, but at that time, not at all.
No, right. So
I find that's pretty unforgivable.
yes.
Yes.
So this is today. This afternoon, I was at a meeting, and I was interviewed as someone who had polio, and I made mention to them that it was an ingested. You got it by ingesting it, and as you say, we didn't know that when I got polio in '53. They thought maybe it was in the air, but of course it wasn't. But this woman, young woman in the same meeting I was at, she was so shocked when she heard that it was an ingested thing, because she was a young, maybe, I don't know, 30-year-old, who thought she heard that you got it by walking on dirty dirt. Like, I've never heard that.
is still
Exactly, now, and
possible.
I just turned and said, well, I hope you are encouraging all young moms to get the polio vaccine. That's all what we can do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I was pretty flabbergasted to see that now we have to be very aware of how we were vaccinated against polio, and to check this out and to double check it so that we really get the injected version of the polio vaccine, because the other one,
Oh,
except the very newest one, the old ones have now mutated into a virus that can still cause polio and still cause just as much havoc as the wild one does.
We still have to tell our polio people to get a vaccination, because at the time of getting polio, they thought you didn't have to get a vaccination, because if you had polio, you weren't going to get it again. And yet there have been people who have had more than one case of polio.
Exactly.
Yeah. So even that is unknown, but more knowledgeable today than COVID, for sure.
Yeah, you certainly did with me a great job of education. And my next question when I see my grandchildren and when I speak to my son and my daughter is, what kind of polio vaccine did my granddaughters get? And when did they get it? And how are they following through? So thank you for that.
I
And
think they give the Sabine, the sugar, the drop,
Yes.
in like African countries, and
Yes, because it's so much easier.
Because it's easier. Mhm.
But it is also much better to have that than to have nothing.
Exactly.
Because it's also cheaper.
Right.
But now we have to revise and go and get the injectables to everybody who we thought was safe.
Right.
Here in Canada and in North America, we have the injectable ones, and it is given.
I checked it.
Yeah, to the children today in 3 to 4 doses.
Yeah.
But it only started in the 90s.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's still plenty of people around that are candidates for a second turn on polio.
That's right.
If they don't get vaccinated.
That's right.
I'm going to take my big mouth and open it.
Well, that's what we're doing. And October was International Polio Awareness Month. And many places had a lot of information as well. Rotary International is working on not just trying to eradicate polio, but to have another organization called Rotary Advocacy for people with polio, to understand more of what's going on with what's called post-polio syndrome.
Yes.
So this is absolutely fabulous, and Rotary has done a marvelous job and is continuing to do this secondary advocacy work.
Can I jump in with a side anecdote for Rotary? I know the Rotary Club from that tiny village, Volda in Norway, where I decided I wanted to be a nurse where I was really needed. I mean, Norway is a big country with very little population, but it's also a rich country. And I wanted to work where I was really needed. So after I heard Abbé Pierre talk about Emmaus, I decided to go to Peru. But it's a long howl from Norway to Peru. And it is the Rotary Club of Volda that paid and organized my trip by boat from Oslo all the way to Lima in Peru. And they have given me not only the trip to go, because I became a volunteer. That meant I had no pay at all. I worked as a nurse for a year and a half. That was the engagement that we took, living in the slums of Lima and Callao, which are some of the most horrible slums that you can find in South America. And going there, and they were wide-eyed and open-hearted enough that they actually paid my return trip. They wanted to make sure that when I was finished there, I didn't have to worry how I was going to go back to Norway. And so I was really very grateful that they did this, because it made my trip possible. I worked at the hospital, and I made sure that for a year, I spent only half of my salary and kept the other half for the trip to Peru. And although I fell in love with a Canadian quite early on in my volunteer time in Peru, and he was going to go back to Quebec, I said, I am not going to cut my engagement short. I have promised I will stay 18 months. I will stay 18 months. If we are meant to be married and stay together, we will still be in love in 8 months. You can come and pick me up then. And that's what he did. So during that time, I stayed and worked. And today I am having to deal, I didn't catch polio, but we still don't know, and this is my latest woes, medical woes. I have a spot on one lung, and it means, and it could mean that it is tuberculosis, or tuberculosis has turned into cancer. There's no way to know other than with a biopsy, and I'm not that curious to find out, to undergo a lung biopsy. So we are just sitting and watching as it is for the last year and a half. But this is a very strange thing that happened to me about vaccines. I was working as a nurse in the slums, but before I left, I got checked, my BCG was checked, and it was vaccine positive. So I was protected when I left for Peru. While I was there was a German doctor that was looking for a nurse to go with him into the jungle of the Amazon and the Ucayali River, because the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Pucallpa had cases that they couldn't explain. They had what they thought many people with pneumonia. They did not respond to antibiotics, and they didn't understand why. And one German doctor, who is also a speleologist, who was exploring caves in his free time, says, I have a suspicion that this might be a fungus disease. Long story short, he wanted a German nurse with him. And so I was taken out of my little dispensario for a month and traveled with him in the villages of the Amazon. And we were doing 4 tests for 4 different fungus diseases and 1 for tuberculosis. And the doctor, to his great honor, being a very thorough man, there was one student and I that were traveling with him, a medical student. He did the same tests on us that he did on the people of the villages. And that's how they found out that my tuberculosis protection from the vaccine had ended. I was virgin. I was negative, BCG negative. So I could have caught, and I was giving injections to tuberculosis patients every day while I was in the barriere, in the slums. So at once I was vaccinated against and protected, but we don't know how long that period where I was unprotected has been before I was checked. So now I'm sitting with that question mark in my lung.
Oh, wow.
But I think it will be fine. I have no pain, no respiratory difficulties or anything. So it is really just something there. And at 83, I don't mind.
Can I ask, have you had COVID?
I have had 5 COVID vaccines and COVID
And COVID, oh,
after the 4th.
oh, really?
Yeah, after the 4th vaccine. And I would not go without the vaccines.
No.
And but now I'm, because I am on cortisone and slightly immunosuppressed, they are doing a test, and for that I have to have the pneumococcal vaccine, I have to have the flu vaccine, and I have to have the latest COVID vaccine. But the doctor said, take one at a time, so that if you have a reaction, we know which one it is.
Of course.
So that's my winter program for vaccination.
No,
And I have looked up, and I have had probably 4 polio vaccines in my lifetime. And a bunch of others. Yes?
Very, very interesting. Yes. Do we have any other questions?
I just
Wendy?
want to
Wendy?
say something. You were in Czechoslovakia?
Yes?
Yes. Well, when I got polio in the 50s, our doctor came from Czechoslovakia, Dr. Gencheft, and he was with us for 10, 12 years, 15 years, and then he got sick and he went back to his country. But we were so grateful to have him come to our little island.
Where were you?
Pardon?
Where were you?
Prince Edward Island,
Oh,
Canada.
to Prince Edward Island. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And
So we
I
were
found
very-
out that Czechoslovakia was one of the first countries that was free of polio.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm.
Really amazing. I was very surprised, but I think because it was then a communist country and they were very keen on vaccination and didn't give people choices for being vaccinated or not, that has helped a lot.
That's, yeah.
And one of the first places they tested the polio vaccine, the Salk vaccine, was in Russia.
Yes.
Yes. So
didn't know that.
that's when they decided it was a good vaccine.
Yep. Even though when it is injectable, it's a little bit more involved and costly. I think I've learned something there. I never thought that there would be a real danger of the transmutation of a virus, but with the hindsight of 50 years or 70 years almost, it is very much so. I didn't think we would get there.
Excellent polio.
How old were either many of you? Did you all get polio as very small children, or is there anybody that got polio when they were adolescents?
I was 9.
Okay.
I was a student nurse and I was 19 when I
Oh.
contracted
Ooh.
it. And my patient, he had polio finally. He was taken to Kingston Hospital one week and I came by ambulance the next week. So
Wow.
Oy, oy. Yeah, that is fast.
yes, and that was in 52-3. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay.
I was 6 months old.
Wow.
Six.
That's-
And that was in the fall of 53.
Were you breastfed?
Oh, I don't know. I never asked that. That's a good
No,
question.
because as a 6 months old, it is surprising in a way that you should, well, no, because feces are still touchable and things, but
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I thought there would be some immunity protection by breastfeeding. But then during that time, there was so much funny stuff going on with breastfeeding that it isn't, it's entirely possible.
Many people in the mid-50s were not breastfed because the bottle feeding was thought to be so much better. And of course it wasn't. And there was no immunity. And so that's one of the reasons they thought that I also got polio, was I was 18 months old when I got it. And that was about the average age, was somewhere between 6 months and 2 years old.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. And that was, well, here in Canada, I don't know about the rest of the world.
Yeah. Is just because of seeing so many more women tonight than men, is there and I don't know that I saw it anywhere, is there a very big difference between women and men getting polio, or females and male?
No.
I had just read somewhere that there is more men, because I said to myself, then where are all the men? Mostly women show up in these Zooms, except the
Yes, but that
Stanley.
is also
We have
with
two
many
men
other
here.
things the case.
We have 2 men in here who.
Yeah, exactly.
Three men.
Good for you guys.
Man, did you know, Joyce?
It's also that the women, as we age, there's more women than men, but also women seem to be more interested in
And more
finding out
involved.
what's going on, whereas the men will wait to find out what's going on.
Oh, there's another one. My husband's sitting right here.
Oh, goody.
Well, Atmos, this has been a wonderful talk. It's been
Thank you.
interesting. I also bought the book that you told me about, the young student nurses of the St. Mary's Hospital here in Montreal. And the stories that the student nurses who lived in the hospital and had to work 7 days a week, every day, 8 to 15 hours a day. And there was no holidays for them. They just kept working. It's amazing that they did not get sick just from the overwork.
Yeah.
And it was quite an interesting book. I gave it over to Helen, who's here tonight, because she was a student nurse. And it was the first year in Quebec that we did not have nursing in the hospital. It was done in
when
the
it was given
college.
over to the CEGEPs.
That's right. And at least you had better hours, I believe, Helen, for the
We
work.
did. We weren't all that well received in the hospitals though, because we weren't doing I don't know what the word is, not the scut work, but we had our 1 or 2 patients. We were learning a lot about the patient care. So we weren't spending our whole day, making beds and making sure that you could put a dime on
Keep labor aspect was gone.
wouldn't move. Exactly. So it was more centered on the actual nursing care than just doing the work on the ward,
Yeah,
Yeah. So
I understand.
We still had the bedpan duties though, Helen.
of course.
Oh, yeah.
That'll always go.
And I don't know that our infectious control was that well monitored in those days. Like it wasn't something that we thought about.
No.
Just did it and steriled your hands, but I don't
And
know.
the doctors were worse than the nurses. I worked in plastics and the doctors would come in and on their plastics rounds and just open the door to the room and take dressings off the patients and just leave them open to the air afterwards. And then they just go into the next room, wouldn't wash their hands. And that's
about
what
the
was
smoke-
done back then, you know?
Ellen, what about the smoking that was going on in the hospitals?
Oh, yes, that's right. They used to
Right.
smoke, yeah.
Yeah. Where I was too.
Mhm.
And I was only 10 years old.
I think one of the things that saved my life is that we had very, very rigorous training in hygiene. But not for what we need when we needed it for the patients of because we weren't sure of the transmission ways, yeah. But washing our hands between one patient and the other is like under our skin. It was very, very rigorous, and that might have helped us.
Right.
Probably did save you from getting sick.
Yeah,
Yes.
Like they tell us for COVID too, to wash.
and
your-
save other people from getting sick,
Mhm,
going
right.
Yes.
spreading it around.
I just want to mention here, Helen, I've got your book still.
Oh, you still have it, The Walking
I do.
Fingers, yeah.
Walking Fingers, excellent book.
That was, yeah, it was quite a while ago. I like the name of the book.
I know,
Yeah.
me too. Right.
Yeah, but COVID and polio, you didn't get the same way. You didn't contract COVID and polio in the same manner.
No,
You know, one was through, contaminated
Air.
water, feces, and the other one was,
yeah, one is a digestive tract
yes. yes.
contagion, and the other one is a respiratory, very clearly.
Mhm. They're different viruses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's kill them all.
Right.
Well, that was just a wonderful talk. And we have another talk coming up. And so I would like to have SusanSchoenbeck introduce herself tonight to tell us about her experience. All of her experience was put out in her book called Polio Girl. And it was a very, very detailed story about how she got polio and how it affected her family, as well as her becoming a nurse. And on that note, I would like to welcome Susan. Thank you for being here.
Would you like me to introduce myself?
Yes, please.
Okay. I was born in 1945. And like some of you said, I was very young when I had polio. I was 7 months old. So you talked about being breastfed and being weaned. I had it then. I live in the US. I live in Arizona. I've lived on both coasts of the United States. I've lived in Oregon for a long time teaching there. I've lived in Florida, and I've lived in the middle of the United States in Colorado. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with those places or not.
So,
I'm come from a family of teachers right now. My husband taught nutrition, and he was a Peace Corps volunteer around the world. One of my children teaches politics. Another teaches climate science, and another is a special education teacher for children who are teens on a psych unit in Portland, Oregon.
Thanksgiving must be really good for you.
Well, we're kind of in Arizona, and the only way we see them at the moment is Zoom because of COVID.
Right.
We live in a state where a lot of people do not believe in vaccination.
Mhm.
So it's isolation all over again. Yeah. So my nursing practice today, I am licensed in Washington and Oregon because that's where my students were for that university. So I keep my licenses there, but I volunteer tutor. The only real practice I have is I do paralegal work for a law firm out of Portland, Oregon. And that is with medical malpractice cases. And I guest lecture via Zoom with Clark College, where I used to present them in person, but for now, they get me via Zoom, okay? My story is going from a child whose parents literally were told when they took me out of the hospital against the doctor's advice, she's never gonna walk, to becoming a nurse. Does not seem too big of a leap to me, because I really think disease can be a gift in some ways. I learned as a child, as a very young child, because when I was taken from my dad's arms, I was immediately put in an iron lung, and my parents could not visit right away. I learned that I was not primarily a body that had a mind, but that I was a spirit, essentially, that could go in and out of my body at different times. And I had a mind of my own, even as a very young child, my mother would say. I would watch from a position above what the doctors were doing, what they were doing to me. And you all remember how many times we had our knees hammered with those rubber hammers and how many lumbar punctures we had to have in Wisconsin. I had polio in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and that's where I grew up and went to nursing school. I watched it and I learned that there were things that I wasn't familiar with, obviously being 6 months old, but I took into me that I could really be outside my body at different times. And just like kids who don't have polio put one foot in front of the other every time they walk, I frequently went in and out of my body that way. A lot of it was to avoid the pain of polio. One of my colleagues in Berlin, Germany, also had polio as an infant. He was 6 months old. And when we talk via Zoom, it's like, we're great friends because we have the same post-polio stuff. And he also had the out-of-body experiences, which is nice to share with someone else.
Yes.
So although I believe that disease can give you a lot of gifts, and I can tell with Atmo, she's got a lot of gifts from having dealt with polio even. We usually don't consider disease to be a blessing. For me, because of what I all learned from it, I think it was a blessing that improved how I could do good nursing. Polio taught me that I can get through a lot of tough things. Polio taught me that kindness and goodness of other people were major factors in how I could get through those things. So my nursing is based on a few principles, and Mona asked me to write them down for you so you'd have an outline. So the first principle is patients are not a disease. I teach in a class mainly called person-centered nursing. You can't call somebody a gallbladder patient. You can't call somebody a leg wound down the hall. They're Mr. whoever they are. Their person comes first, and we talk about their disease as something we can help them with. Our primary focus, and what I tell all students is, sit down with that patient and listen to them. We need to know who they are, what their goals are, and what are the kinds of things we can do as nurses, because we have a lot of connections, to help them reach their goals. That's our job. I also help student nurses and other nurses, because I've been a director of nursing, to know that just like I am scared lots of times, our patients are really scared, just like we were when we had polio. Our patients may be feeling uncontrollable pain and the fatigue that naturally goes with pain, because I know that because I have polio and experienced the same. They may see patients who are stoic and they don't cry. Just like we didn't tell people our real feelings until sometime later in life. We knew it wasn't a good thing. We were trained, especially in the German community. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You held your feelings inside. We didn't share, I'm hurting. We didn't share, I feel afraid. And for me, that's a gift I give to my students because I tell them all people feel this way. And we all grieve for the bodily function that we have lost. I grieve for that still every day. It depends on what's hurting that day, what I'm grieving for. So my students, I say, be sure to sit down and be quiet. Research has shown that sometimes just sitting with a patient, saying nothing is better than just going on and on and on and on about your own experience. I recently came across a note because I've been sorting. I have 3 children and I'm sorting photographs, old letters, and dividing them into 3 boxes, and they're going to the kids finally. I'm ready to give them up, saving only a few. This patient note said, and it was from the mother of a 2-year-old who died in a car accident. The mother was driving. This was at UW Hospital in Madison. She said, I remember you because you didn't let me feel alone. You sat by me. You were quiet when I wanted to rest, but you didn't let me feel alone. Where did I get that from? I felt alone in the hospital, right? I learned that as a gift from polio, not to make people feel like they were alone. Polio survivors in the groups that I talk with have one big complaint, and that they're very alone in trying to figure out how to control pain and how to control other symptoms of PPS, like swallowing, like their orthopedic issues with braces, cold intolerance, new joint pain, and especially the extreme fatigue. And I hear I'll be talking with you some later date about some measures you can use to help you figure stuff out for yourself and track it and take charts of your pain and fatigue into a physician and say, hey, let's deal with this. But most polio survivors say the doctors just say, well, you're getting old. And this dismissive attitude really makes the people I talk with angry because they're not being considered as a person. They're being considered a disease that the physician who's standing in front of them probably has never had in their curriculum in school. The nursing school I teach for, of course, has a polio module, but that's only because I'm teaching there. My colleague and I have 2 papers. One is formally been accepted as a nursing journal. It will be out in Nursing 2023, and it's on how to help the polio survivor with their pain. Our second article is about how to be person-centered with the polio survivor because they're all different. The virus didn't go through them all in the same way, just like COVID isn't going through everybody in the same way. But we're seeing kind of the long haul symptoms of COVID, just like we saw the long haul symptoms of polio. I can't say, having had 6 months, that my PPS came 30 or 40 years later. I was feeling it when I was a teenager. I already had the long haul symptoms. I got progressively more worse. And I would say at 30 and 40, I had to really pace myself because the fatigue and the pain kicked in more. At age 40, I ended up having what we call my polio leg, which is my right leg, opened up at my hip and a bone piece taken out like this, probably like that. And my ankle opened up at my at my feet, 2 different teams, and it plopped in there, and then they just sucked out a bunch of bone marrow and put it in all aside. And I have a solid ankle. Because what was happening at 40 was I had 3 children, I was working, I was trying to take care of a household. That doesn't all jive for the polio survivor. It just doesn't work. I was falling down a flight of stairs. And I happened to have a colleague who was an orthosurgeon, and he said, I can do this surgery for you without even putting a pin in you. And that's what he did. The funny part of it was, because he was an orthosurgeon, you know how surgeons are. I got home and tried to put on my high-heeled shoes, which weren't really too high, and I couldn't walk. I couldn't walk in my shoes, even that had a little bit on them. So I've been wearing tennis shoes a very long time, ones that have good support, because that suits me best with the alteration I had to make for that. Polio, I would say, as I guess I wrote it down here, I'm looking, as principle 3, it's not a disease of the past. If we polio survivors can speak up and share with our doctors, and sometimes demand of our doctors that they look at our sheets of paper and say, oh, well, I guess this does happen with you, and this is post-polio syndrome. And we also share with COVID survivors that this is what happens, and we want them to speak up to their doctors today also and get the treatment that they need for long haul COVID. We don't want them dismissed like we were and spend years hiding out, ashamed of all of the symptoms that we have that we don't particularly want to share with people. I took student nurses to India to give immunizations on the India-Pakistan border. We got off the plane in New Delhi, and there are people sitting on the dusty streets that are crippled from polio, begging. They're everywhere. Polio is today's world in India. Parents lined up at dawn before we even opened the school buildings where we gave vaccinations. And they just steepled their hands at the end and bowed and thanked us so much for giving their children vaccinations. Principle 4, polio does affect family dynamics. Every disease does. And that's why we as nurses try to be person-centered and family-centered and say, okay, who's going to be helpful? Who cannot maybe be helpful to you? How can we fill that gap? Put the gum in there so the dike doesn't leak on you. Each person has to figure out how they're going to be with this person who has an illness. My dad had his own mantra. He said, no matter how hard it gets, Susie, you're going to make it through. You feel that sorrow, you let it go. You keep reaching for your goals. Luckily, he was a stock clerk. So he had my brother and I, we had lists for our chores all the time. He taught me 4 words: work, study, play, rest. I learned how to pace before I had post-polio because that's the way our family operated. When my children went to college, my dad wrote them letters. They all said, before love, Grandpa Al, work, study, play, rest. But polio affected my mother differently. My mother's mantra was, they're all going to think it's my fault. Because like Atmo said, we didn't really know how it was transmitted. My mother scrubbed the walls of our apartment with lye soap, so much that her hands were just beet red, my dad said, because she was so afraid that she gave me polio. There was not a day in her life that she didn't worry about that.
Oh, God.
On her deathbed, and we both knew she was dying, she said to me, I wish we could have done more. And I said to her, but Mom, you did everything and more. But she worried about it through her death.
Oh, geez.
I was having a conversation via email today with a polio survivor in Portland. And we both wondered aloud, which I've wondered many times, did our parents suffer more than us? I truly feel my mother did. My father got right in there and dug his hands in. He went to the hospital and he stood before the little window where you could look at your kid if you were lucky. And there were a crowd of parents trying to look at their kid. And he watched the nurses do the Kenny method. And he watched them do the rubbing of the calves and the warm cloths. He grew up on a farm. So he said, this is not rocket science to me. I know what it's like when a calf is born and their leg is cramped up and your grandpa tells me to rub the calf. He said, Margie, which was my mother's name, I would like to bring her home. This doctor says she will never walk. And he wants to do this experimental surgery where he takes a tendon out of her good leg, my left leg, and puts it in her right leg. I just don't think that's right. Now get this, my dad had an 8th grade education. My dad was a really good thinker. So they brought me home. I had a big brace, the steel thing with the leather straps and the latches on it. My dad did all the putting on of the warm compresses. My mother got the hot steaming bowl ready, put the cloths in, and then handed them to my dad and stood back. But he sang to me. He was a musician on the side. That was his side job. He had a band. And he got me through all that. Gradually, I surprised them all because they would take me to a lake outside of Milwaukee because I wasn't allowed in the pools. And my dad would just float me in his arms. And one day they saw my leg kicking, supposedly, the story they tell me. And they thought, well, if she can move it that much, we're keeping coming. So I learned how to swim before I learned how to walk. And I think part of it was their faith that somehow that muscle that he was religiously rubbing and putting warm cloths on would not atrophy so much that I would be able to be one of those outsiders who could throw that brace off. And my mother said you threw it off anyway, actually. During the night, you would, as you got older, you would open up the latches and they would hear it thud to the floor. My mother said, I was just too tired to get up all those nights to put it back on. And then she told me my brother Mike, he was older, would come in and hear me crying with the brace on, and he would unlatch it because then I could at least roll over. So my mama at first thought everybody was watching her, and then she changed her mantra. As she grew up and she saw, well, this kid can actually stumble around and walk. It may not be pretty, but she can do it. She started to protest. My brother and I were in the same grade school, and it was around May 1st, probably April, the end of April, and we each brought home a note about the maypole dance. You know, parents, you're invited, your kid's gonna go around the maypole, you're gonna have these ribbons. But mine had an extra added note that said, we're gonna have a bench for Susie to sit on and watch. My mother didn't like the note. My mother went to Miss Demand. I still remember her name was the principal. And she said, I would like Susie to be in the maypole dance. And Miss Demand told my mother that, well, parents had already talked with her. And they said they didn't want me in the maypole dance because it might spoil the whole thing if I fell down. And it would spoil their pictures because they didn't look right or walk right. My mother didn't give up, and I was in the maypole dance. And thank goodness I didn't fall that day. Not that I don't fall a lot. My older brother, bless his heart, had the mantra of do what you can do well. He said, frankly, you're a lousy runner. Today, I can't even remember the day when I could run, but then I could run. He said, you're coming out to me with the alley and we're going to shoot baskets. And I'm going to teach you how to be a really good free thrower. So on the girls' high school basketball team, I was a guard, not a very good one. But if they needed someone to throw a free throw, I could do it. So when Polio Girl came out, I took a piece of cardstock and I typed up every time I mentioned him in the book, 37 times, which was too few for all he did for me, and wrote him a note. And he just sent me a text and said, crying. So I guess he was happy to get his note. Principle 5, which is probably the central theme in Polio Girl, is kindness and goodness can get you a whole lot further in life. I had people in my life who didn't have to be so good to me, who were. In the 60s, like Atmo said, we girls couldn't go to become a doctor. It just wasn't considered viable. I went to a very scholastic high school. It was like one of the top 10 in the US. So I had taken physics and I had taken trig and I had taken all the sciences. But I was poor. So I signed up for entrance exams at the county free School of Nursing. I went there and I met my friend's mother. I worked at the Milwaukee Journal in high school, part-time. And my friend's mother was the intake counselor at the county School of Nursing. She gave me the tests. Then she sat down with me to explain them. And she said, Susie, you should go to college. And I looked at her and I said, no, I can't because I don't have the money. No one in my family's ever been to college. I wouldn't even know where to start. So she took out her big notebook, she started writing. Then she ripped out the page and turned it around and she gave it to me. And she said, these are the things you'll have to do. So I graduated early from high school because I had enough credits. I went to work full-time for the Milwaukee Journal, and I was a waitress at a pizza parlor in the evenings. And I did that. I took off a year and a half. And then I took entrance exams for the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I got my undergraduate degree there. And that's when I got my first polio vaccination, because they couldn't graduate me unless they checked off this box that said you had the polio vaccination. Otherwise, I wouldn't have received one then. Everybody then thought, like what Mona said, that, well, we were the most immune people around. But in fact, according to public requirements, I had to have that, and I got it at that time. Right now, my son, who is a climate scientist, is going to COP27, which is this international conference in Egypt about climate change. And he has been talking with his doctor about getting another polio booster before he goes. And they have to do it now this week so that he has enough time to build immunity. What the CDC is doing in the United States is saying, we're not going yet to requiring everyone to have another vaccine, but if you're going to certain countries and places in the countries, like Max, my son, had to tell him where in Egypt, you will be given a booster before you go there, because there's too much going on in those countries. Every month I get a report from the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, and it tells me with circles where polio is around the world. I don't know if we'll have more in the US. We have an anti-vaccination theme going on in our politics, so it's pretty scary. We know where there are pockets of people that don't believe in vaccination. I've been with a doctor who was giving a talk in Boulder, Colorado about childhood diseases and was booed off the stage by anti-vaxxers. This is why I say I'm in isolation here. I only go, I mean, I'm with my husband, thank goodness. I only do things with people outdoors. We just had a party 2 nights ago to welcome new neighbors who bought houses on our block. And it was outdoor at my friend's, who has a bigger backyard. And everyone was good with it and everyone respected that. But there's lots of people who don't. The other day I was walking people from my backyard out my front door, and a neighbor was running her dog like it was a dog park in front of my house. And I asked her to please leash her dog. And she told me to go back in my house. She said, my dog wouldn't bother you if you didn't come out. So this is the kind of environment we're living in. But I refuse to go that way. I just refuse to go that way. I still actually remember the bus driver who used to take me on the bus to go to my job at the Milwaukee Journal. And this guy was so full of kindness and goodness. He would open the doors and I would have to hold both sides to pull myself up on the bus. And he would wait till I got my change in to the change thing and walk back to my seat. And then he shut the doors and started the bus. He always made sure I was all right. Same thing when I pulled the thing to get off. I could see him looking through the rear view mirror. He always made sure I got up to the front. I had enough time. Then he opened the door and I got off. That man's kindness and goodness made me less anxious. And when I'm less anxious, my calf muscle doesn't spasm so much. So he saved me a whole lot of pain so many times. Principle 6, be sure you keep playing to your strengths. When I was a nursing student, my instructors said, you're so darn organized, due to my father. How would you like to be the first student nurse trained for ICU work? You know, I looked in the ICU and I saw kids and adults flat on their backs, blaring lights, nurses running around with carts and stuff. That all looked normal to me, right? We already experienced that. That didn't scare me. It might have petrified my instructors who never came through the door, but it didn't petrify me because I'd already been there. I'd already understood how scared these people had to be. I was educated by Atmo, 3-year diploma nurses who were in the unit and we're still friends today because I was the first baccalaureate nurse in there. It was a unit for children who were having open heart surgery up to being 80 years old and having open heart surgery. I didn't understand, not being a mother yet, the rule that we had that mothers who were nurses could not take care of dying babies. I thought that was a very good rule, and it really sunk in when I became a mother. Parents of these children who are in our unit couldn't stay in Madison, Wisconsin, where the hospital was. They had jobs and they had bunches of other kids at home to take care of. So we were their whole life while they were there. It was hard because you knew you wanted to take time to rock them or just sit there and talk with them, play a game with them, and you couldn't do that very much. When I would walk through the unit outside of the ICU to go to the cafeteria for lunch, there was always one nursing assistant who would have her face plastered up against the glass, and she'd be looking at all the little incubators because we had really little babies. And she just loved watching them. And I said to her, hey, would you like to come in sometime and just spend time rocking the babies? Maybe sitting with the kids, holding their hands, talking to them. And she was thrilled. So she did. And we had someone in that rocking chair more often, which was great for the children. Even though they had tubes, she wasn't afraid of their chest tubes. She wasn't afraid that they had oxygen. She became my 3 children's babysitter as they grew up. I always felt when I left the house, I had God with my children. I wasn't worried. I was always fine. Polio actually led me to do my master's research on the visitation needs of patients when they're in ICU. And that was published in Heart and Lung Journal so that people might consider how they can get parents and families together more. In the ICU at that time, parents only got to visit when they could visit 5 minutes out of every hour. I knew as a polio kid, I would have killed to get more time with my parent, right? Yeah. So that was my contribution toward visitation in ICU. My polio snagged me again to do more research because the unit that I worked in, this was in the early 1960s, or early 1960s, mid 1960s, late. The open heart surgery that we did on patients led them to have cardiac arrest because the surgeons would be in there messing with their heart. We didn't have all the drugs we have today to stop atrial fib, to stop premature ventricular contractions. We just didn't have it. So it was normal. Their heart could stop 5 times before they went home, 10 times. We would just jump up on the bed, do CPR, and get them back again. So one day I was doing that, and it was one of my newer times in the unit. So I didn't get to go back for coffee with the older nurses and hear a change of shift report. I had to watch the patient beds. And Eunice, I can say her name now because it's been so long. She had another cardiac arrest. I got up on the bed. I started CPR. I tried to pull the call light to get help. I don't know that I was successful at that. And all of a sudden, Eunice said to me, "I'm back now. Susie, you can stop." And I'm like, "Oh, maybe, she said, "You're pounding on my chest." And she said, "You know where I've been? I've been out of my body, and I traveled and I saw my parents, and they said, it's not your time." And she came back. And that lady walked out of the unit. We didn't have an outside unit to our ICU. Patients were admitted to it and they left it. The chief surgeon didn't allow anybody but nurses he knew who were trained the way he wanted them to work that unit. He didn't even allow med students in the unit. We once had a patient who had a cardiac arrest in a Hubbard tub, which is like a big water tub. And all the med students in the hospital went to resuscitate her, and they broke every rib in her body. He kindly took this patient in on a ventilator. She was on a ventilator with us for 6 months, and we were used to ventilator patients, but we got to love her. And that lady too walked out of our unit. Very few patients died in that unit. After my time seeing so many patients and hearing about so many trips, I did do more research on near-death experiences after CPR. And that body of knowledge is published in the International Association Near-Death Studies Journal. But I also then was getting asked to do talks in like the hospital where I had taught in the 3-year diploma school. That was my first teaching job. Sister Myra made me do it. And in the audience one night, evidently there was a publisher, because I was at that point, had been recruited to be the death and spiritual care nurse for the University of Wisconsin. So I was doing that role. Like, she got the call and said, "Can you have lunch with this publisher tomorrow?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm not sure. It depends on how many calls I get from the ER, because I'm at their beck and call." It was me picking up a chaplain, if I could find one along the way, to go with me. So we did have lunch, and he said, "I would like you to write up some of your stories that the patients have told you." And I said, "I have 2 kids in college right now and 2 jobs. I'm not sure I can do that." And then he explained to me the first book he wrote was on earthworm growing. And he worked for a publishing company. He knew nothing about earthworms. They gave him a box, cardboard box of books about worms, and that was his job. He said, "If you could give me a story at a time, I'll clean them up. I'll do the whole book. Just give me the stories." So that's how that book came out. Working as the death and spiritual care nurse for the University of Wisconsin, I did not want to be parochial in any of my opinions. I did not want to be religious in any of my opinions. But I can tell you about one particular time, and it's the first time I told the family about what I had learned from going into that unit as a student nurse, because I wasn't afraid, because I already seen it, because I had polio, and hearing the stories that reminded me of when I'd go out of my body too, just to get away from the pain. And I did not do it consciously. I couldn't choose it. I never chose it. It just happened. At this time, on this particular day, I met a family. Their child, their baby, had been brought in by ambulance from their babysitters. The coroner had pronounced the baby dead due to sudden infant death syndrome. When the young parents arrived, the coroner and the chaplain and I were there as the coroner told them. The mother just had the worst look of terror across her face I've ever seen. She was in such shock. She just looked straight around us. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. And I took the couple off into a room on the side of the ER to get them away from all the commotion. And there were just 2 metal chairs there, so they sat on the chairs and I knelt on the floor. The chaplain stayed for a while too, and he knelt. The mother sobbed, and she was sitting in a chair, and I will never forget how she just rocked and sobbed and did not make any eye contact. And you could hear the metal scraping. It was just a cheap little folding chair on that floor as she rocked, and it scraped. And a nurse brought the baby in, which was a custom of the time. It was swaddled in a blanket, and the mother didn't want it. So the father took his daughter in his arms. He just kept looking at her, and then he'd look at his wife, who kept rocking, the chair scraping and her sobbing. And I knew from polio that sometimes things are so horrible that you can't talk about them right away, and that's okay. So I was quiet. And then the father said to me, "Where do you think Jenny is?" Jenny was the name of the baby. And it took all my guts to look at him and say, "Do you really want to know some of the things patients have told me?" I didn't share my own experience. I shared my research person, nurse cap experience, and told them that I've been told so many times that people who have been clinically dead, but we've brought back, have met people who love them, who told them that they had to go back into their bodies. And the father looked at his wife and he said, "Do you think your mother met Jenny?" And then he looked at me and said, "Her mother just died 6 months ago." And the mother actually stopped rocking. And she looked at her husband and she said, "Jenny could be with Mom."
Mm.
And I thought, I sure didn't make up this game, but polio taught me a lot. Polio taught me I could be a spirit. Polio taught me I could listen to these stories and believe them when other people thought I was crazy, teased me. And yet there was a whole world out there of researchers who were doing the same research I was, saying this happens all the time. And this was helping a family because I was listening. I was putting my hat on that said, don't talk too much. Listen to these people. Tell a little bit of what you know. Let them absorb that and see if this story gives them hope. For this couple, it did.
Mm.
I had a lot of patients in the role as death and spiritual care nurse who were in precarious positions, some not injured as much as others, many spinal cord head injuries, motorcycle accidents, car accidents. Halloween reminded me of a patient that I had who, as a young student at UW-Madison, jumped off a building Halloween night thinking he could fly. There were a lot of, there was a lot of use of drugs in the city of Madison with the students. I will never forget walking his dad from the nursing station into his room the first time he saw his son. Some of those images just stick with you. Polio again taught me that sometimes don't pump families about what they're feeling right now. Give them time to let that pain settle. Give them time to find their own words to talk with you about it, so that you're not talking about yourself and your own idea of what their pain is like. Help them talk to you about what they think their pain is like. I think I'm gonna go ahead and see if I had one more point. Yes. How I teach nursing, how I taught clinical nursing. Polio taught me to have a two-step back technique, because I still liked in clinical teaching all the tracheostomy and all the wound care and all the gooey stuff. My students had to do tough procedures when they were seniors. And I would say, this is how I organize it if you'll go along with me. Day one, I get in there and I show you just what a nurse does. Day two, you set up all the equipment and it's your turn to do it. But if you're scared and you don't want to do it that day, you take 2 steps back. And I'll step in and do it. The patient will never know the difference. You'll just think you're the same nurse as the day before. But by the 3rd time, almost every student could do the procedure by the 3rd day. And I found that something I learned from polio, that we're all scared. Students are scared. You need to respect that. Patients are scared. Respect that. Some of the patients on the spinal cord injury floor would look at me because I was limping and think, well, man, you're kind of like one of us. I can ask you the real questions. What can I do for my constipation? This is really horrible. I read in a magazine, all patients who have spinal cord injuries get these flashy magazines. I want to know if you know about this silver bullet suppository. I can ask you because you're a nurse who limps and understands what it is to have disease. So I talked a lot about constipation and how to relieve it.
Big hanging lamp there. So she's over here somewhere.
No, there's a box
A box she's looking for.
that they hide in.
Well, the one polio nugget that I'll share to wrap up with you is that I think I learned from polio that we're all surrounded by possibilities. And our job is to listen to those and decide which ones we follow. We are pretty unique. We have a lot of perceptions about illness, about sickness, about family. And if we share them with others, and if we take our goodness and our kindness, we can change lives for people. And if we, with our goodness and kindness, do help others individually, then I think we have conquered.
Wow. This was a wonderful talk, Susan. Wow.
I've been a pretty blessed person.
Being able to meet and talk to people with polio through these different Zooms, we've heard so many stories, and yours is just the culmination of all of these stories. And your experience with nursing really put like another spin to this.
I'm glad.
It's just been wonderful. Reading your book was a wonder. I'll show it again. It's been a really marvelous story. Polio girl. And when my husband sees the book, he says, "There's my dancing friend." And that's you at the maypole, even if the maypole isn't there.
Well, I hope that the latter part, especially of the book, helps polio survivors, because I wrote it in everyday language. So you can go and say, hey, I'm feeling this way. You can find advice in the book about it, but also there's a bibliography in the back. And you can take the book to your doctor and say, if you don't believe me, just read this.
There were lots of
still-
things. When you look at the book and how I've read it, I have all these markers everywhere through the book. And yes, I want to bring that up to the doctors who don't seem to understand. And you really brought that to us today. And we have a big job to tell our own doctors who are not polio specialists, who have no idea, even
Right.
those that have. And I'm very lucky, I have a doctor who is a polio specialist, and I still have to tell her how I'm
Mhm.
doing and what is happening. And she tries to understand. And we have a few doctors, Dr. Marnie, she's also in the US, and she
Oh,
had
she's my
polio.
friend. Yeah,
She's your friend.
yeah.
And
We met in Boulder, Colorado this summer.
wow.
Yeah.
And we've all become friends of other people with polio. And that's what Zoom has given us.
Yes.
I'd like to open up to a few minutes of questions. Please, would people like to ask a question?